My daughter's imaginary friend asked me, "Do you know about Daddy's special box in the garage?" "What kind of box, sweetie?" "A metal one, behind the Christmas decorations." Mr. Whisper says Daddy looks at it when he's sad. My husband Ray was at work. He'd been pulling extra shifts lately. I'd never seen any metal box in the garage. We'd lived here 3 years and I knew every corner of that cluttered space. But Joyce was so specific that evening while Ray watched TV with Joyce, I went to the garage. Behind the plastic bins of decorations, wrapped in an old blanket, was a small metal lockbox I'd never seen before. My hands shook as I carried it to our bedroom. Inside were photos. Ray with a woman I didn't recognize, both smiling, clearly in love, wedding rings visible, more photos of them with a baby, a death certificate for an infant named Rayon Jr., another for a woman named Cassandra Wagner, both dated 8 years ago, 2 years before Ray and I met. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Joyce stood in the doorway. I quickly closed the box, but she'd already seen. She tilted her head the way she did when listening to something. Mr. Whisper says Daddy loved them very much, but the car accident wasn't his fault. Ice ran through my veins. Ray had told me he'd never been married, never had children, said his past relationships weren't worth discussing. I'd believed him, trusted him completely. Over the next week, Mr. Whispers revealed more through Joyce. Always during innocent moments, coloring, playing with dolls, bath time. Daddy used to live in Michigan. Daddy visits special graves every October. Daddy still has Cassandra's voicemail saved on his old phone. I found the phone in his toolbox. Password protected, but Joyce cheerfully provided it, courtesy of Mr. Whispers. The voicemail was there. "Hey baby, we're just leaving Mom's house. Ray and Jr. won't stop fussing, but we'll be home soon. Love you." Cassandra's voice was warm, loving. The timestamp was an hour before the accident that killed her and their son. Ray had been at work. They'd been coming home to him when a drunk driver ran a red light. "Why didn't you tell me?" I confronted Ray after Joyce was asleep. The color drained from his face when he saw the photos spread on our bed. He collapsed into a chair, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. I couldn't. Every time I tried, I wanted to start fresh. To not be the widower, to not see pity in your eyes every day. But lying, for 6 years? I know, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We talked until dawn. About Cassandra, about Rayon Jr., about the guilt that ate him alive, about why he'd hidden an entire life from me. I understood the pain, but not the deception. We agreed to counseling, to working through it. But Mr. Whispers wasn't done. "Daddy has another secret," Joyce announced at breakfast. "In his phone. The new phone." Ray was in the shower. His phone sat on the counter. I knew I shouldn't, but trust was already shattered. His texts were mostly work-related until I found a conversation with someone named M. "Can't wait to see you Tuesday." "Same. Your wife doesn't suspect anything?" "No, I told her it's another work trip." Tuesday. Ray had said he'd be at a conference in Chicago. My stomach churned as I scrolled up. The messages went back months. No explicit photos, but clear evidence of an affair. Meeting locations, inside jokes, complaints about me. When Ray emerged from the bathroom, I held up his phone. He knew immediately. "It's not what you think." "Really?" "Because it looks like you're cheating." "It's my therapist. M is Dr. Melissa. I've been seeing her about Cassandra and Rayon. I didn't know how to tell you I needed therapy." He showed me the appointment confirmations, the billing statements. Dr. Melissa, grief counselor, specializing in traumatic loss. He'd been getting help but hiding it, just like he'd hidden everything else. Why the secretive messages? She said protecting the therapeutic space was important, that I needed somewhere you couldn't follow. I know how it looks. I wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, but trust was gone. Every explanation felt like another potential lie. How many secrets could one person have? That night, Joyce crawled into our bed. "Mr. Whisper says Daddy's telling the truth about the doctor, but not about the money." Ray went rigid beside me. "What money?" "The money from the accident. Mr. Whisper says you told everyone you gave it to charity." I turned on the light. Ray's face was gray, caught in another lie. There'd been a settlement from the drunk driver's insurance. He'd told me earlier he'd donated it, saying he couldn't bear to profit from their deaths. "Where's the money, Ray?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I've been sending it to someone. Monthly payments for 8 years. Who?" But I think I already knew. The way Joyce tilted her head when Mr. Whispers talked. The specific details no imaginary friend should know. The timing of his appearance right after her 6th birthday. The same age Rayon Jr. would have been. Ray's next words confirmed my growing suspicion. The drunk driver had a daughter. She was in his car but survived. She needed medical care, therapy, special schools. I've been paying for all of it. I looked at our daughter, who was smiling sadly. Too sadly for a 6-year-old. "Joyce, sweetheart, who is Mr. Whispers really?" She glanced between us, then spoke in a voice that wasn't quite her own. I was never the same after what she said. Joyce's voice came out flat and strange when she said the drunk driver's daughter is named Giselle, and she lives in Grand Rapids, and Daddy sends her money every month on the 15th. I stood there frozen with the photos of Cassandra and baby Rayon still in my hands, and I watched my 6-year-old daughter tilt her head in that listening way while she recited facts she had no business knowing. She told me the amount was $800, and it came from a special account Daddy opened before we got married, and the words kept coming in that detached voice like she was reading from a script she'd memorized without understanding what it meant. My chest felt tight, and my hands started shaking so hard I nearly dropped the photos, and I realized Joyce had been carrying pieces of Ray's grief around in her small body for months, while we thought she was just playing with an imaginary friend. The bedroom door flew open and Ray appeared in the hallway, his face going white when he saw Joyce standing there, and the lockbox open on the bed and me crying with his dead wife's pictures scattered around my feet. He looked at Joyce and then at me, and I saw the exact moment he understood that she'd told me everything, and his shoulders sagged like someone had cut all the strings holding him upright. I forced myself to stop crying long enough to tell him to take Joyce to her room and read her a story while I tried to calm down, because I needed space to process what just happened, and what it meant that our daughter knew things she absolutely shouldn't know. Ray moved toward Joyce like he was walking through deep water, and he picked her up gently and carried her out without saying anything, while she wrapped her arms around his neck and went back to being a regular 6-year-old instead of whatever she'd been a minute ago. I heard their footsteps going down the hall and Joyce's door closing, and then I was alone with the evidence of Ray's entire secret life spread across our bed. I sat down on the floor because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore, and I picked up each photo one by one and studied Cassandra's face and tried to understand how Ray had loved her and lost her and never told me any of it. The death certificate sat on top of the pile with their official stamps and dates, and I traced my finger over baby Ryan's name and felt sick thinking about Ray visiting graves every October while telling me he was going to work conferences. An hour passed before I heard Joyce's door open again and Ray's footsteps coming back down the hall, and I stayed sitting on the floor surrounded by photos because I didn't trust myself to stand up and have this conversation like a normal person. Ray came in and started to explain, but I held up my hand and told him I needed him to answer specific questions with complete honesty. No more stories about fresh starts or avoiding pity, because every single explanation he'd given me so far had turned out to hide something else underneath. He sat down in the chair by the window and nodded, and I could see he was already crying, but I couldn't feel sorry for him yet because I was too angry and confused and betrayed to access any softer emotions. I asked him exactly how much money he'd been sending to Giselle, and for how long, and he admitted it was $800 a month for 8 years, which came to over $76,000 he'd hidden from our household finances. He said the settlement from the drunk driver's insurance was $200,000, and he'd been slowly sending it to Giselle for medical bills and therapy, and special schools because she was injured in the accident that killed his family. I did the math in my head and realized he still had over $100,000 somewhere, and I asked where the rest of it was, and he said it was in the same account earning interest until Giselle needed it for college or medical expenses. The idea that Ray had been managing this huge amount of money without ever mentioning it made me feel like I didn't know him at all, like I'd been married to a complete stranger who looked like my husband, but had an entire financial life I knew nothing about. Ray started explaining that Giselle was 12 when the accident happened, and her father was driving drunk with her in the car, and she suffered a traumatic brain injury that required years of rehabilitation and special education. He said he couldn't keep money that came from the death of his wife and son, but he also couldn't just hand it over in a lump sum to a child, so he'd been sending monthly payments through a personal checking account I didn't know existed. He told me he'd set up the account before we got married and had his paycheck split between our joint account. And this secret one, and I realized every budget conversation we'd ever had was based on incomplete information because he was hiding a significant chunk of his income. I asked him how Joyce knew about any of this, and he looked down at his hands and admitted he'd been keeping a journal where he wrote letters to Cassandra and Rayon. He said sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep, he'd read the letters out loud in our bedroom or in the garage, and Joyce must have been listening from the hallway or through the baby monitor we never disconnected from her room. The image of my daughter standing in the dark hallway absorbing details about graves and payments and her father's hidden grief made me feel physically sick, and I told Ray that his secrecy hadn't just damaged our marriage, but had hurt Joyce in ways we didn't fully understand yet. He broke down crying and admitted he knew he'd messed up everything by trying to handle his grief alone, but he didn't know how to let anyone in without drowning in the pain all over again. I watched him cry and felt a confusing mix of anger and sympathy, because I understood grief was hard, but I couldn't understand why he'd built an entire life on lies, instead of just telling me the truth from the beginning. I told Ray he needed to sleep in the guest room tonight because I couldn't share a bed with him while my head was spinning with questions about what else he'd hidden from me. He gathered his pillow without arguing and left, and I sat alone with the photos of Cassandra wondering what kind of person she was, and whether she would have understood why her husband built a second life on secrets, instead of letting anyone help him carry his grief. The next morning, Joyce came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and asked if Daddy was in trouble, and I had to figure out how to explain adult problems to a 6-year-old without making her feel responsible for revealing them. I knelt down so we were eye level and told her that Daddy had some very sad things happen before we were a family, and sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about how to handle sad feelings, but none of this was her fault, and we were going to figure it out together. Joyce's face scrunched up the way it did when she was thinking hard, and then she asked if Mr. Whispers was real, or if she made him up. I realized she'd been using this imaginary friend as a way to process information she wasn't supposed to have, giving herself permission to know things by pretending someone else told her. I pulled her into a hug and told her that sometimes our brains create friends to help us understand confusing things we hear, and it was okay that she needed Mr. Whispers, but now we were going to talk about feelings with real words, instead of pretending an invisible friend told us secrets. I grabbed my phone and called Laura before I could talk myself out of it. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it twice while searching for her contact. She answered on the second ring, and I barely got out the words emergency and need you before my voice cracked. She said she'd be there in 20 minutes and hung up without asking questions. I paced the kitchen while waiting, looking at the photos spread across the counter and the bank statements Ray had printed out showing 8 years of monthly transfers to an account I'd never known existed. When Laura's car pulled into the driveway, I met her at the door, and she took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug. We sat at the kitchen table and I showed her everything while Ray stayed upstairs. I could hear him moving around up there, probably listening to see if I was going to kick him out or call a lawyer or just completely fall apart. Laura studied each photo carefully, ran her finger down the columns of numbers on the bank statements, and finally looked up at me with this serious expression I'd only seen a few times in our lives. She said this wasn't normal relationship problems where you go to a weekend workshop and learn to communicate better. She said this level of lying about major life events and hiding money for 8 years meant I needed real professional help to figure out if the marriage could even be saved. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, because hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been when it was just me and Ray fighting. Laura pulled out her phone and started searching for therapists while I sat there feeling numb. She asked what kind of issues we needed help with, and I didn't even know where to start, so I just listed them. Dead wife, dead baby, secret payments to drunk driver's daughter, financial deception, daughter overhearing everything, trust completely destroyed. Laura kept typing and clicking through websites, reading reviews and checking availability. She found someone named Elias Rawlings who specialized in grief and trust issues and blended family dynamics, which seemed to cover most of our disaster. His website said he had experience with financial deception in marriages, and I thought that was probably a nice way of saying he'd seen other husbands hide massive secrets from their wives. Laura called his office and explained we had an emergency situation and needed the first available appointment. The receptionist put her on hold for what felt like forever, and then came back and said Elias had a cancellation tomorrow evening at 7. Laura looked at me and I nodded and she booked it. I realized I also needed to get Joyce some help because no 6-year-old should know the things she knew about adult grief and money and dead families. I called my doctor's office, and when the receptionist answered, I asked for a referral to a child psychologist. She asked what the situation was, and I gave her the shortest version I could manage. My daughter has been exposed to information about death and adult problems that she's too young to process. The receptionist was quiet for a second, and then said she had just the person. Kira Kim, she said, spelling out the last name for me. She works specifically with young children dealing with family stress and trauma. She gave me the number, and I called immediately and scheduled an intake appointment for next week. Ray came downstairs while I was still on the phone with Kira's office, and he stood in the doorway looking like he wanted to ask something but was afraid of the answer. I hung up and told him we were going to couples therapy tomorrow evening with someone named Elias Rawlings, and he needed to come prepared to answer every single question I had with complete honesty. He said okay immediately, no arguing or making excuses, and asked if there was anything he could do right now to help. I looked at him standing there in our kitchen where we'd made breakfast together 1,000 times, and told him he could start by explaining exactly how he'd been hiding $800 a month from our joint finances for 8 years. Ray pulled out his laptop and logged into a bank account I'd never seen before. He showed me the separate checking account he'd opened before we even got married, back when we were still engaged and combining our lives. It had his name only and received automatic deposits from his paycheck that I'd never noticed, because I trusted him to handle his own direct deposit paperwork. Every month, $800 went into that account, and then straight out to someone named Giselle Owens. He'd been living on less money than I thought he earned all these years, essentially paying Giselle before paying into our household budget. I stared at the screen showing years of transactions and suddenly understood why Ray always said we couldn't afford things I thought were within our budget. Every time I'd suggested a vacation to the beach or redoing the bathroom or getting a newer car, Ray had said we should wait and save more. I'd believed him because I trusted him with money and thought he was being responsible. But he wasn't being responsible. He was protecting his secret payments to Giselle. The anger I felt was confusing because it was mixed with this strange respect for his commitment to helping this girl whose father had killed his family. He'd given up vacations and home improvements, and probably a lot of other things to make sure she got the care she needed. But the deception still felt like a betrayal that made my chest tight, because he'd made financial decisions that affected our whole family, without ever including me in the conversation. I spent the rest of the afternoon on my laptop looking up public records from Michigan to verify everything Ray had told me. I found news articles from 8 years ago with headlines about a drunk driving accident that killed a woman and infant. The articles described how Cassandra Wagner and her 1-year-old son Rayon were driving home when a man named Thomas Owens ran a red light going 60 in a 35 zone. His blood alcohol was twice the legal limit, and he had his 12-year-old daughter Giselle in the car with him. Cassandra died at the scene, the baby died 2 hours later at the hospital, and Giselle was in critical condition with a traumatic brain injury. I sat there reading these horrible details and realized this was Ray's actual life, not just a story he'd made up. The newspaper archives had follow-up articles about Thomas Owens being sentenced to 15 years in prison for vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated. There was a photo of him being led into court in an orange jumpsuit, and he looked destroyed, like someone who knew he'd ruined multiple lives, including his own daughter's. I found myself feeling unexpected sympathy for everyone involved in this tragedy. Ray, who lost his whole family, Giselle, who got hurt because of her father's terrible choice, even Thomas Owens, who had to live with knowing he'd killed 2 people while his daughter suffered. I called the county clerk's office in Michigan and asked for copies of the death certificates for Cassandra Wagner and Rayon Wagner Jr. The clerk said they could mail certified copies within 2 weeks, and I gave her our address. Having independent verification felt important even though I already believed the basic facts of Ray's story, because I needed physical proof I could hold in my hands. That evening at dinner, Joyce was quiet and kept looking between Ray and me like she was trying to figure out if we were okay. I made an effort to keep conversation normal and light, asking about her day at the school and what she wanted to do this weekend. She told us about art class and how she'd painted a picture of our house with a big tree in the front yard, even though we didn't actually have a big tree. Ray asked what color she'd painted the door, and she said purple because purple was a happy color. I watched Ray struggle to act normal and ask follow-up questions about her painting, while knowing our marriage was hanging by a thread and everything might fall apart. After Joyce finished her bath and I tucked her into bed with her favorite stuffed rabbit, I found Ray sitting on the couch staring at his phone but not really looking at it. I sat down next to him and told him I'd made an appointment with a couples therapist named Elias for tomorrow evening, and he needed to come prepared to answer every question I had with complete honesty, even if it was hard or embarrassing. Ray set his phone down and looked at me with tired eyes and asked if I thought our marriage could survive all this. I told him honestly that I didn't know, but I was willing to try if he could learn to be open and honest instead of hiding things to protect me, because his protection had actually hurt me more than the truth ever could have. He nodded and said he'd be completely honest at therapy, and I wanted to believe him, but trust felt like something I'd lost and didn't know how to get back. The next evening, we drove to Elias's office in separate cars because I'd come straight from work, and Ray had picked Joyce up from the school and dropped her at my sister's house. The office was in a small building near downtown, with a waiting room that had comfortable chairs and magazines nobody ever read. Elias came out right at 6 o'clock and shook both our hands, and he was maybe 50 years old with gray hair and a calm way of moving that made me feel slightly less anxious. We followed him into his office and sat on a couch while he took a chair across from us with a notepad. He asked us each to describe what brought us here, and I took a breath and started talking. I told him about finding the lockbox in the garage, about discovering Ray's first wife and baby who died 8 years ago, about the secret therapy appointments and the hidden bank account sending money to the drunk driver's daughter. I explained how Joyce had been overhearing Ray's private grief rituals and processing it through an imaginary friend, and how every time I thought I knew everything, there was another secret waiting underneath. Ray sat beside me looking smaller than usual, his shoulders hunched forward and his hands clasped between his knees. When I finished, Elias turned to Ray and asked him to share his perspective, and Ray was quiet for a long moment before he started talking. He admitted he'd been living a double life emotionally, never fully leaving Cassandra and Rayan behind, but never fully present with me and Joyce either. He said he kept one foot in his grief and one foot in our marriage, and he'd been trying to balance between them without letting either side see the other, but obviously that hadn't worked, and he'd hurt everyone by trying to keep the two parts of his life separate. His voice cracked when he talked about how much he loved both families, and how guilty he felt that loving me and Joyce sometimes felt like betraying Cassandra and Rayan, even though he knew that didn't make sense. Elias asked Ray why he'd chosen secrecy over honesty from the beginning, and Ray explained that every time he thought about telling me the truth, he imagined seeing pity in my eyes forever. He said he wanted to be seen as himself, as Ray, not as the tragic widower who lost his wife and baby in a horrible accident. He thought if he could manage his grief privately and keep it contained, then it wouldn't affect our relationship, and I could just love him without that shadow hanging over everything. He admitted now that he'd been wrong and that hiding it had actually made everything worse because the secrets had poisoned our trust, and his grief had leaked out anyway through his behavior and his late-night garage visits that Joyce had overheard. Elias wrote something in his notepad, and I watched Ray's face as he talked, seeing the pain and shame there, but also still feeling angry that he'd made these choices for both of us without giving me a chance to decide if I could handle the truth. I told Elias that I could have handled the truth about Ray's past, that I wasn't some fragile person who couldn't cope with the fact that my husband had loved someone before me and lost her tragically. What I couldn't handle was lied to over and over again, and discovering new secrets every time I thought I finally knew everything. I explained that the issue wasn't Ray's grief or even the payments to Giselle, it was the pattern of making major decisions alone, and then hiding them from me, which had created a marriage where I couldn't trust anything Ray told me, because there might always be something else he was keeping from me. Elias nodded and said that was exactly the problem, that secrecy had become Ray's default response to difficult emotions, and that pattern had damaged the foundation of our relationship. He said we needed to rebuild trust through consistent transparency, and that would take time. An effort from both of us, but especially from Ray, who needed to learn new ways of handling his grief that didn't involve hiding it from the people who loved him. Elias asked about our finances, and I explained that Ray's secret account meant he'd been living on less income than I thought we had, which had affected every budget decision we'd made as a couple. I told him about all the times I'd suggested vacations or home improvements, and Ray had said we should wait or we couldn't afford it. And now I understood he was protecting his monthly payments to Giselle, but at the time I just thought we were being financially responsible together. Ray admitted he'd never thought about it as financial deception, because in his mind the settlement money wasn't really his to begin with. It was blood money from the death of his family, and he couldn't keep it for himself. Elias pointed out that hiding significant monthly expenses from your spouse is a serious breach of trust, regardless of the motivation, and that Ray had essentially been making financial decisions for both of us without giving me any say in how our household money was managed. He asked Ray if he could see how that would make me feel we're excluded and disrespected, and Ray said yes, he could see that now, but at the time he'd just been focused on making sure Giselle got the support she needed. When we got home that night, Joyce was already asleep in her bed because my sister had brought her back and put her down, and Ray asked me if he should stay in the guest room again. I told him yes because I was still processing everything from therapy, and I needed physical space to think clearly without him next to me in bed. He looked hurt, but he accepted it without arguing, and he gathered his pillow and phone charger and went down the hall to the small room we usually used for guests. I lay awake in our bed for hours wondering if I was married to someone I actually knew, or just a carefully constructed version he'd wanted me to see, and whether the real Ray was someone I could still love and trust, or if too much damage had been done. The next morning, I was making coffee when my phone rang and the school counselor's name appeared on the screen. She told me Joyce had told her classmate about the dead baby during recess yesterday, and now the other child's parents were concerned and wanted to know what was going on. I felt my face burn with embarrassment and anger that Ray's secrets had now spilled into Joyce's school life, and were affecting her relationships with other kids. The counselor said she needed to talk to me in person about the situation, and I explained that we were dealing with a complicated family situation, and Joyce was starting therapy next week with a child psychologist. She said that was good, but she still needed to meet with me today to make sure Joyce was safe and getting appropriate support. I had to call in sick to work even though I'd already missed a day 2 weeks ago for a doctor's appointment, and my manager was clearly frustrated when I told her I had another family emergency. She said she understood but reminded me that we were in a busy period, and the team was counting on me to be reliable. I could feel my job security slipping, and I felt angry at Ray all over again, because his hidden grief was now affecting my professional life, as well as my personal one. I drove to Joyce's school and signed in at the office, and they directed me to the counselor's room down the hall past the library. At the school, I met with the counselor in her small office that had children's drawings on the walls and a box of tissues on the desk. She was kind, but firm about needing to know if Joyce was safe at home, and I had to assure her that there was no abuse or danger, just complicated family history that Joyce had overheard and misunderstood. I explained in vague terms that Joyce had been exposed to adult information about loss and grief that she was too young to process in a healthy way, and that we were getting her professional help to work through it. The counselor asked specific questions about whether Joyce had witnessed any violence or been exposed to anything inappropriate, and I had to explain that she'd overheard her father talking about people who died before she was born, and she'd shared that information at the school without understanding why it was upsetting to other kids. The counselor seemed satisfied with my answers, but said she'd be monitoring Joyce's behavior closely and would need updates about the therapy sessions. That afternoon, after I picked Joyce up from the school and dropped her at home with Ray, I tried to reach Dr. Melissa because I wanted to understand what she knew about the situation and whether she'd encouraged Ray to keep secrets from me. The receptionist answered, and I explained who I was and asked to speak with Dr. Melissa about her client Ray. The receptionist said she couldn't discuss any client without their explicit permission due to confidentiality rules, and she couldn't even confirm whether someone was a client without their consent. I felt shut out of yet another aspect of Ray's life, and when I got home I confronted him about it. I told him I'd tried to call his therapist and been blocked by confidentiality, and I asked him why I couldn't have access to information about therapy that was affecting our marriage. Ray said his therapy was supposed to be a space where I didn't follow him, a place where he could work through his grief without worrying about how it affected me, and he claimed Elias had supported that boundary during our session. I didn't remember Elias saying that exactly, but I was too tired to argue anymore, so I just walked away and started making dinner while Ray sat in the living room with Joyce watching cartoons like everything was normal and our family wasn't falling apart. Our second session with Elias happened 3 days later, and I came prepared with a list of questions I'd written in my phone during sleepless nights. Ray sat next to me on the same couch, but the space between us felt bigger than before, and I noticed he kept his hands in his lap instead of reaching for mine like he used to. Elias asked how the week had been, and I jumped in before Ray could give some sanitized version of events. I told Elias I'd tried to contact Ray's therapist and been blocked by privacy rules, and I felt excluded from something that was clearly affecting our marriage. Ray started to defend himself, but Elias held up a hand and explained that individual therapy does need to be separate from couples work, because people need space to process things without their partner present. But then Elias looked directly at Ray and said the problem wasn't that he had private therapy, it was that he'd been using privacy as an excuse for secrecy. And there was a big difference between having personal space and hiding major life decisions from your spouse. Ray's face went red and he looked down at his hands. Elias continued that Ray should be bringing insights from his individual work into our marriage, not using therapy as another locked box that I couldn't access. I felt relieved that Elias understood what I'd been trying to say, and I asked Ray point blank about Giselle and whether she even knew who was sending her money all these years. Ray was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him deciding whether to lie or tell the truth. Finally, he admitted that yes, Giselle knew it was him, and she'd sent him thank you emails a few times over the years. The betrayal hit me fresh and hot in my chest. He'd been in communication with this girl, even limited communication, and he'd never once mentioned her existence to me. Not when we were dating, not when we got married, not when Joyce was born. 8 years of secret emails on top of secret payments on top of secret grief. Elias asked Ray to show me the correspondence, and Ray pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He opened his email and searched for Giselle's name, and 3 messages came up spanning several years. The first one was from 5 years ago, and it was short and awkward, thanking Ray for the money and saying she hoped he was doing okay. The second was from 3 years ago, saying she'd graduated from a special program and wanted him to know the payments had made it possible. The most recent one was from 6 months ago, and it said she was starting community college, and the support meant she could focus on the school instead of working full-time to pay for her medical bills. All 3 emails were polite and grateful, but also uncomfortable, like she didn't quite know how to thank someone for money that came from such terrible tragedy. I read them twice while Ray sat there looking miserable, and I realized this girl had been carrying her own weird guilt about taking money from the man whose family her father killed. I asked Ray if he'd ever met Giselle in person, and he said no quickly, like he'd been waiting for that question. He explained he'd kept everything to emails and bank transfers because he didn't want to insert himself into her life beyond the financial support. Something about this felt both respectful and cowardly at the same time. I couldn't tell if Ray had been protecting Giselle from complicated emotions, or protecting himself from having to face the living reminder of his family's death. Probably both. Elias leaned forward and said that Ray's relationship with Giselle, however distant it was, represented unfinished business that was affecting our marriage, whether Ray wanted to admit it or not. He asked Ray if he'd ever thought about what closure with that situation might look like. Ray's eyes went wide with panic, and he said he couldn't stop supporting her when she was still dealing with the consequences of the accident. His voice got louder as he talked about how Giselle still had medical appointments and therapy, and she was only 20 years old, and she deserved a chance at a normal life after what his family's death had cost her. I realized as I listened that Ray had tied his own healing to her well-being in a really unhealthy way. He couldn't let himself move forward until she was okay, but she'd probably never be completely okay, which meant Ray was stuck in this loop forever. Elias must have seen the same thing because he suggested we table that discussion for now and focus on concrete steps Ray could take to rebuild trust in our marriage. The session ended with homework for both of us, and I felt exhausted as we walked to the car. That night, after Joyce finally fell asleep, I went downstairs to get water and noticed the garage door was open a crack with light spilling out. It was 2 a.m. I pushed the door open and found Ray sitting on the cold concrete floor with the lockbox open in front of him. Photos of Cassandra and baby Rayan were spread around him, and he had his old phone in his hand. He was crying silently, tears running down his face while he stared at a picture of his dead wife holding their infant son. He looked up when he heard me, and his face crumpled with shame. He told me he came out here sometimes when he couldn't sleep and looked at the photos and listened to Cassandra's voicemail. He said he was sorry, and he knew now that Joyce must have followed him out here, or heard him through the baby monitor talking to pictures of his dead family. His voice broke on the last words. I stood there for a minute feeling anger and sadness and something else I couldn't name. Then I sat down next to him on the cold floor, and for the first time I felt real compassion for the weight he'd been carrying alone all these years. I was still mad about the lying, but I could see how much pain he was in. I told him his grief was valid and his love for Cassandra and Rayan didn't threaten me. What threatened me was his secrecy. He needed to find a way to honor his past without hiding it from his present. Ray wiped his face and asked me what I needed from him to start rebuilding trust. I'd been thinking about this constantly, so the answer came easily. I needed complete financial transparency, including access to all accounts and statements. I needed a clear plan for how we'd handle the payments to Giselle going forward as a couple decision, not his solo project. And I needed him to stop hiding his grief rituals, and instead find appropriate times and places to remember his first family that didn't involve sneaking around in the middle of the night like he was doing something wrong. Ray nodded at everything and said he'd give me access to all his accounts tomorrow. We sat there a while longer in the cold garage, and then we went inside together. The next morning, after Ray left for work and Joyce was at the school, I called Laura and asked for the name of that attorney she'd mentioned. She gave me Franklin Meter's number and said he was great with complicated family financial stuff. I called his office and explained to his assistant that we needed help setting up a formal arrangement for ongoing support to someone outside our immediate family. The assistant scheduled me for a consultation that afternoon. Franklin's office was in a boring building downtown, and his waiting room had magazines about money management that nobody ever reads. When he called us back, Ray had rushed over from work, and we sat across from Franklin's big desk while he asked questions about our situation. I let Ray explain about Cassandra and Rayan and the accident and Giselle and the 8 years of payments. Franklin listened without judgment and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When Ray finished, Franklin said he could help us set up a trust that would provide transparent structure and protect our household finances while making sure Giselle kept getting support. He asked for our financial documents, and Ray pulled up his bank statements on his phone. Franklin spent 20 minutes reviewing everything, and then he looked up with a serious expression. He explained that Ray's informal payment arrangement had created potential tax problems because he'd been sending significant money without proper documentation or gift tax filings. The IRS could come after us for back taxes and penalties if they ever audited us. Franklin said that setting up a formal trust would solve these problems and also give us clear boundaries around how much and for how long we were committed to supporting Giselle. Ray looked sick at the mention of tax problems, and I felt another wave of anger that his secrecy had potentially put our whole family at financial risk. Franklin pulled out a calculator and started running numbers while Ray and I sat there feeling sick about potential IRS problems we didn't even know existed. He explained that we needed to file amended tax returns for the past 3 years and pay penalties, which would cost us several $1,000s we didn't have budgeted. Ray looked like he might throw up, and I felt that familiar anger rising again because his secrecy kept creating new problems we had to solve. Franklin said he could refer us to a tax attorney who could help minimize the penalties, but we needed to act fast before the IRS discovered the issue themselves. We left his office with a stack of paperwork and instructions to gather every financial document we had for the past 8 years. The next morning, I took the day off work to organize our finances, spreading bank statements and tax returns across the dining room table while Joyce was at the school. Ray came home during his lunch break, and we worked together in tense silence, highlighting transactions and making notes about which payments went to Giselle. Our couples therapy session that evening felt heavier than usual, because now we weren't just dealing with emotional betrayal, but actual legal and financial consequences. Elias listened to our update about the tax problems, and I could see him processing how much deeper this situation went than typical marriage counseling. He asked Ray how he felt about all these consequences piling up, and Ray admitted he felt like he was drowning in mistakes he'd made while trying to do the right thing. Elias nodded and said, "That's often how grief works. It makes people act in ways that seem logical in the moment, but create bigger problems down the line. Then he gave Ray a specific assignment that would take real work. He told Ray to create a complete timeline of everything, starting from when he met Cassandra all the way through to right now, including every major event and decision. He wanted Ray to write down details about their relationship, the accident, the settlement, when he started sending money to Giselle, when he met me, when he decided to keep secrets, everything. Elias said Ray needed to share this timeline with me so we'd finally be working from the same set of facts, instead of me discovering new pieces every few days. Ray looked overwhelmed but agreed to do it. Over the next week, Ray spent his evenings after Joyce went to bed sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing page after page while I gave him space. I could hear him crying sometimes, but I didn't go to him because he needed to do this work alone. When he finally handed me the document a week later, it was 15 pages long, front and back, filled with his cramped handwriting. I took it to our bedroom and closed the door and started reading. The timeline started with how Ray met Cassandra at a coffee shop in Michigan when they were both 23. He described their first date, how quickly they fell in love, their small wedding with just family. He wrote about finding out Cassandra was pregnant and how scared and excited they both were. Then came details about Ray and Junior being born 6 weeks early and spending time in the NICU, and how they just started to feel like they had their life together when everything fell apart. The entry about the accident day was the hardest to read. Ray wrote that he was supposed to drive Cassandra and the baby home from her mother's house that Sunday afternoon. They'd planned it that way because Cassandra's mom lived an hour away, and Ray didn't want her driving tired with the baby. But then his boss called that morning and offered him an extra shift, time and a half pay because someone called in sick. Ray and Cassandra needed money badly because the NICU bills were crushing them, and they wanted to move to a bigger apartment before Rayan got too big for their tiny place. So Ray took the shift and told Cassandra to drive herself home. She left her mom's house at 4 in the afternoon with Rayan in his car seat. At 5:15, a drunk driver ran a red light and hit them on the passenger side where Rayan was sitting. Both of them died at the scene. Ray was at work when the police came to tell him. He wrote that he spent 8 years thinking about how if he'd kept the original plan and driven them home himself, they might have left at a different time. Maybe they would have hit green lights instead of red. Maybe they would have stopped for gas. Maybe they would have missed that drunk driver by 30 seconds and still be alive. He knows it's not logical to think this way, but he can't stop. Every decision he's made since then has been shaped by the guilt of choosing money over driving his family home safely. Reading this made me understand Ray's behavior in a completely different way, even though it didn't excuse the lying. His secrecy about Giselle, his need to send her money every month, his inability to tell me about his past, it was all connected to this massive guilt he carried about surviving when they didn't. He was trying to pay back a debt that couldn't actually be paid back. The timeline also included details about the settlement, how the drunk driver's insurance paid out $200,000, and Ray couldn't stand the thought of keeping it. He researched what happened to the driver and found out he had a 12-year-old daughter who'd been in the car and suffered a brain injury. The driver went to prison, but the daughter Giselle needed years of medical care and therapy. Ray started sending her money through her grandmother who had custody, $800 a month to help cover what insurance didn't. He never told anyone, not his family, not his friends, and definitely not me when we met 2 years later. The timeline ended with finding me, falling in love, getting married, having Joyce, and living with the constant fear that I'd discover his secrets and leave him. At our next therapy session, I brought the timeline with me and told Elias I'd read every word. Ray looked nervous, like he was waiting for me to be angry again, but instead I told him I finally understood that his secrecy and his payments to Giselle were both forms of penance for surviving when his family didn't. It didn't make the lying okay, but it helped me see the pattern underneath all his choices. Elias asked us to talk through the difference between honoring Ray's grief and letting it control our current family. This was hard because Ray had never really separated the two things in his mind. He thought being a good person meant carrying his guilt forever and making financial sacrifices to make up for being alive. Elias helped him see that he could remember Cassandra and Rayan and support Giselle without letting survivor guilt run his whole life and damage his current marriage. Ray admitted he'd never thought about it that way before. He'd just been trying to get through each day without drowning in the pain. While all this was happening with Ray's therapy, Joyce had her first appointment with Kira. I took her after school one Wednesday and sat in the waiting room while they met for 50 minutes. Joyce came out looking tired but okay, and Kira asked if she could call me later to discuss her initial thoughts. That evening after Joyce was in bed, my phone rang and it was Kira. She said Joyce had been very open during their session, and she had some concerns about what she called parentification. I didn't know that word, so Kira explained that Joyce had been exposed to adult information and problems that were way too big for a 6-year-old brain to handle. She said Joyce had created Mr. Whispers as a psychological distance tool, a way to know things she wasn't supposed to know while also not taking responsibility for knowing them. By saying Mr. Whispers told her things, Joyce could share the information without feeling like she was tattling or breaking rules. It was actually a pretty smart coping method for a kid, but it meant Joyce had been carrying adult stress and secrets that were hurting her development. Kira said Joyce needed clear boundaries about what information belonged to adults and what was appropriate for children. She needed to see her parents managing their problems without her help or awareness. Kira gave me specific recommendations, including stopping all serious conversations anywhere Joyce might overhear, removing any monitoring devices from her room that might pick up adult conversations, and giving her age-appropriate explanations for any changes in our family without the heavy details. I realized immediately that we'd been having intense conversations late at night thinking Joyce was asleep, but she'd probably been listening to everything. The next day, I went into Joyce's room while she was at the school, and looked at the baby monitor we'd never bothered to disconnect. It sat on her dresser with the little green light showing it was on, broadcasting everything to the receiver in our bedroom. I thought about all of Ray's late-night garage visits, all the times he'd been in there crying and talking to photos of Cassandra and Rayon. The monitor would have picked up sounds from the hallway, from our bedroom, from anywhere in the house if Joyce had been awake and listening. I unplugged the monitor and put it in a box in the closet. Then I made a new rule that Ray and I would only discuss our marriage problems during therapy sessions, or when Joyce was definitely out of the house, not late at night when we assumed she was asleep, but couldn't be sure. I told Ray about the rule that evening, and he agreed immediately, looking guilty about how much Joyce had probably overheard. A few days later, Franklin called to say the trust documents were ready for us to review and sign. He scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday afternoon, and Ray took time off work, so we could go together. Franklin's conference room had a big table, and he laid out multiple copies of the trust paperwork, walking us through each section. The structure he'd created included a monthly payment to Giselle that would continue until she turned 25, or completed her education, whichever came first. The amount was $700 a month, slightly less than Ray had been paying, but Franklin said it was a more sustainable number that wouldn't strain our household budget as much. The trust was formalized and transparent, and both Ray and I would have to agree to any changes, which meant Ray couldn't just decide things on his own anymore. Franklin also explained that the trust included provisions for us to adjust or end the payments if our financial situation changed dramatically, like if one of us lost our job or we had major medical expenses. This gave me some feeling of control I hadn't had when Ray was making unilateral decisions about thousands of dollars every year. Ray looked uncomfortable reading that part, and I could tell he felt like he was somehow betraying Giselle by putting limits on his support. But he signed the documents anyway because he knew our marriage depended on having clear boundaries around this situation. After we finished signing everything, Franklin suggested we might want to inform Giselle about the change from informal payments to a formal trust structure. Ray's face went pale at the idea of direct communication with her. Franklin said it would be more respectful than just having the money suddenly show up from a different source with a different amount. I suggested we send a joint email explaining the change and offering to answer any questions she might have. Ray looked terrified but agreed this was better than leaving her confused about what was happening. That evening, Ray sat at the computer and drafted an email to Giselle. He wrote that he'd formalized the support through a trust to make sure it continued reliably and to be more transparent with his current family. He apologized if the change caused her any concern, and said the monthly amount would be slightly different but consistent. He showed me the draft and I read it twice. Then I told him he should also mention that his wife now knew about the arrangement and supported his commitment to helping her. I didn't want Giselle to think I was the villain who forced this change, or that I resented her getting money that could have gone to our household. Ray added a paragraph saying his wife understood the situation and agreed that supporting Giselle's recovery and education was important. He hit send before he could change his mind, and then we waited to see if she'd respond. 2 days later, Giselle's response appeared in Ray's inbox, and we both sat at the kitchen table reading it on his laptop. She wrote that she was actually relieved to have everything formalized, because she'd always felt uncomfortable accepting money from someone who lost so much. She said Ray's support had made an enormous difference in her recovery and education, but she'd also felt guilty taking money that should have gone to his new family. Knowing the arrangement was structured and agreed upon by both of us made her feel less like she was stealing from people she'd never met. Ray's hands were shaking as he scrolled down to read the rest. I watched his face go pale as he reached the second part of her message. Giselle wrote that she'd been working with a therapist on survivor's guilt about the accident, and her therapist thought it might help to have a conversation with Ray in person if he was willing. She emphasized that she didn't expect anything beyond a single meeting, and she'd understand completely if we weren't comfortable with it. She said she just wanted to offer the possibility because her therapist believed it might help both of them process what happened. Ray closed the laptop and put his head in his hands. I asked him what he wanted to do, and he said he honestly didn't know. At our next therapy session with Elias the following Tuesday, we brought up Giselle's request, and Ray looked like he might throw up just talking about it. Elias asked Ray what scared him most about meeting her, and Ray said he was terrified of seeing the physical evidence of what the accident did to her. He said he'd been sending money to an email address for 8 years, but meeting her in person would make everything real in a way he wasn't sure he could handle. I admitted I was curious about her and thought meeting might help me understand this part of Ray's life better, but I was also worried it would be too emotionally intense for everyone involved, and I didn't want to make things worse. Elias suggested we could agree to a single meeting in a neutral location with clear time boundaries, so nobody felt trapped. He said we could each bring a support person if that felt safer, and he offered to attend as a neutral facilitator to help navigate the conversation if it got too difficult. Ray asked if Elias thought this was a good idea, or if it might actually make Ray's grief worse. Elias said he couldn't predict that, but he believed facing difficult emotions with proper support was usually better than avoiding them forever. After discussing it for another 20 minutes, Ray and I agreed to meet Giselle with Elias present to help if the conversation became too hard to manage alone. We scheduled the meeting for 3 weeks out to give everyone time to prepare emotionally, and in our following sessions, Elias coached Ray and me on what to expect. He taught us how to set appropriate boundaries during the meeting and how to ask for breaks if we needed them. He emphasized that this meeting was about acknowledging the connection between our lives and Giselle's, not about Ray seeking forgiveness or Giselle expressing gratitude. He said we all needed to respect whatever emotions came up without trying to fix them or make them go away. Ray started keeping a journal to process his feelings about the upcoming meeting, and I could see him working hard to prepare himself mentally. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, I noticed Ray was sleeping better and getting out of bed without that heavy, exhausted look he'd carried for months. He told me one night while we were doing dishes that having everything out in the open felt like he could finally breathe, even though the conversations had been painful and our marriage was still uncertain. He said keeping secrets had required so much energy that he hadn't realized how exhausted he was until he stopped. I told him I was glad he felt lighter, but I was still working on trusting him again, and that would take more time. Joyce had been doing better too, according to Kira's weekly reports. She'd stopped mentioning Mr. Whispers completely, and was using regular words to talk about her feelings, instead of channeling information through an imaginary friend. She'd asked me a few simple questions about why Daddy seemed sad sometimes, and I gave her age-appropriate answers about how grown-ups sometimes have sad memories from before kids were born. I told her it wasn't her job to fix those feelings, or to know all the details about grown-up problems. Kira said Joyce was responding well to having clear boundaries about what information belonged to adults, and what was okay for kids to know. The day of the meeting with Giselle arrived, and Ray and I drove to Elias's office together in complete silence. Ray kept tapping his fingers on his knee, and I could see sweat on his forehead even though it was cool outside. We parked and sat in the car for 5 minutes before Ray said he was ready to go inside. Elias greeted us in the waiting room and said Giselle had arrived a few minutes earlier with her own therapist. We walked into his office, and I saw a slim young woman with dark hair sitting on the couch. She had a noticeable limp when she stood up to shake our hands, and there was a scar on her forehead that ran from her hairline to her eyebrow. She looked nervous, but smiled politely as Elias made introductions. We all sat in a circle with Elias positioned between Ray and Giselle, and Elias started by thanking everyone for being willing to have this difficult conversation. Giselle spoke first and thanked us for agreeing to meet her. She looked directly at Ray and told him his support had made an enormous difference in her recovery and education, and she wanted him to know that. But she also wanted him to know she was doing well now, and she didn't want him to feel responsible for her forever. She said she hoped the trust arrangement would continue through her education, but after that she wanted to be financially independent, so Ray could invest in his current family instead. Ray started crying before Giselle finished talking, and he told her he was sorry for what his family's death had cost her, even though he knew the accident wasn't his fault. Giselle cried too and said she was sorry that her father's choices killed people Ray loved, and she'd carried guilt about that for 8 years. She said she knew logically that she wasn't responsible for what her drunk father did, but she still felt like she should apologize for being connected to the person who destroyed Ray's family. It was strange and painful watching them both apologize for things that weren't their fault. I realized they'd both been carrying guilt that belonged to Giselle's father, and they needed to release each other from responsibility for his terrible choice. I understand. I'll write the continuation covering beats 61 to 69 as a single continuous paragraph with proper sentence structure, maintaining 6th grade vocabulary, minimal dialogue, and seamless continuation from the previous content. Giselle wiped her eyes and looked directly at me when she spoke next, her voice steady despite the tears. She said she wanted the trust to keep going through her education, but after that she hoped to be on her own financially, and she wanted Ray to use that money for his current family instead. She told me she was sorry for being a secret in my marriage, and she hoped the formal arrangement would help us move forward together. Ray reached for my hand and squeezed it, and I could feel him shaking beside me. Elias asked if anyone had more to say, and we all shook our heads, emotionally worn out from the hour we'd spent together. Giselle's therapist walked her out first, and we waited a few minutes before leaving, giving everyone space to process what had happened. Ray and I walked to the car in silence and sat there for almost 30 minutes before either of us could speak. He stared at the steering wheel and told me that meeting Giselle had changed how he saw everything, because she wasn't the broken child he'd been picturing all these years, but a strong young woman who'd built a real life despite terrible circumstances. He said he thought he'd been using the payments as a way to stay tied to Cassandra and Rayan, like keeping Giselle in his life meant keeping them close too. He admitted maybe it was time to find other ways to remember his first family, ways that didn't involve sending money to someone who reminded him of the worst day of his life. I asked him what other ways he meant, and he said he didn't know yet, but he wanted to figure it out in therapy instead of just doing what felt right in the moment. We drove home and picked up Joyce from my sister's house, and Laura could tell from our faces that the meeting had been intense, but she didn't ask questions in front of Joyce. That night, after Joyce was asleep, Ray and I sat on our bed facing each other, and he told me this was the most honest conversation we'd had in weeks. He admitted he wasn't sure he knew how to be married without keeping secrets because hiding his pain had become such a habit over the years. He said when something hurt, he automatically looked for ways to handle it alone instead of bringing it to me, and he knew that wasn't fair, but he didn't know how to change patterns he'd built over 8 years. I told him I needed him to learn because I couldn't live wondering what else I didn't know, constantly waiting for the next secret to show up. He promised he'd work on it with Dr. Melissa, and he'd try to bring me in instead of shutting me out, even when it felt uncomfortable or scary. Over the next few weeks, I watched Ray make real efforts to be more open with me, and it was awkward at first because neither of us knew how to do this new version of our relationship. He started telling me when he was having a hard grief day, instead of disappearing into the garage for hours, and he'd say he needed some time alone, but he'd tell me why and when he'd be back. He asked me to help him make financial decisions instead of just handling everything by himself, and we sat together at the kitchen table going through bills and budget planning like we should have been doing all along. It felt strange to be learning basic relationship skills after 6 years of marriage, but slowly I started to feel like we were actually partners instead of two strangers sharing a house and a kid. Franklin sent us the final trust documents in a big envelope that arrived on a Tuesday, and seeing the official paperwork made the whole arrangement feel real and manageable instead of this secret thing hanging over us. The first payment to Giselle had already gone through from the trust account, and the statement showed exactly where our money was going and how much was left. Ray seemed lighter after that, like knowing his commitment to Giselle was secure, but also had clear boundaries took some weight off his shoulders. I felt more secure too because I could see everything now. No more hidden accounts or secret transfers that affected our household without my knowledge. Joyce's teacher sent home a note saying she'd been more engaged in class lately, and playing better with the other kids during recess. And when I mentioned it to Kira, she said removing the burden of adult information had let Joyce just be a kid again. Joyce still saw Kira once a month for check-ins to make sure she was processing everything okay, but the urgent crisis feeling had passed and she was learning healthy ways to talk about her feelings instead of creating imaginary friends to handle them. Ray and I kept going to couples therapy with Elias every other week, working on how we talk to each other and rebuilding trust through being consistently open about things. Elias helped us create actual agreements about financial decisions and grief rituals and how we'd handle difficult topics in the future, and having these clear structures made both of us feel safer in the relationship. 3 months after I found the lockbox in the garage, Ray suggested we take a family vacation to the beach, something we'd never been able to afford before. I realized this was possible now because we'd restructured our finances, and I actually knew what money we had available, and I agreed because I wanted to build happy memories as a family, instead of just managing one crisis after another. We booked a week at a rental house near the ocean and drove down with Joyce singing in the back seat, excited to see the beach for the first time. We're not perfectly healed and probably never will be because Ray's grief and my broken trust don't just disappear like they were never there, but we're doing better as a family and building something more honest than what we had before. Joyce plays in the sand building castles while Ray and I sit together on our beach towels watching her. And I think about how we're all survivors of different terrible things learning to live with our scars while still reaching for whatever joy we can find. So that wraps things up. The importance of financial transparency in relationships cannot be overstated. Subscribe for more practical stories about trust and money. Catch you next.